a fertiliser bill on one guy's property went from 60,000 when he was conventionally converted to biodynamics, and in a very short time it was down to less than $10,000. And even that's, it's hard to spend that. I've seen with my own eyes how up to 4 inches of darkened soil can occur in 1 or 2 years. That's provided it's not in the middle of a drought.
Welcome to this podcast series, Biodynamic Farmers and Gardeners in Australia. The series was commissioned by Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Ltd and produced by Householders Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Incorporated Australia. Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Ltd is a not-for-profit company located in Bellingen, New South Wales. It has been making and supplying biodynamic preparations as well as supporting biodynamic growing in Australia for over 30 years. Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Ltd values biodynamics as a practical and holistic technique that is able to regenerate soil, supercharge organic growing, restore biodiversity, and work with Mother Nature. The podcast series was produced on and adjacent to the traditional lands of the Djarawar, Gayabal, Yugara and Waka Waka First Nations peoples of the surrounding region. We pay respect to the past, present and emerging leaders of all First Nation Australians in this country and celebrate the unique contributions their cultures make to this place. And in the context of this podcast series, particularly those contributions involving Indigenous respect for and stewardship of the nature of Australia, with its attendant spiritual and practical care for country, the sovereignty of which was never ceded. Hello, my name is Andrew Nicholson and I am the producer of the Biodynamic Farmers and Gardeners in Australia podcast series. My guest on this episode of the series, John Hodgkinson, is a highly experienced and knowledgeable biodynamic grower who first encountered biodynamic methods in the mid-1990s and started using them on an existing 40-hectare farm he then owned and ran. So impressed was he with early results that he launched into full-scale adoption of the biodynamic method on his property. After selling his farm in 2005, John moved to Bellingen, New South Wales, and has kept very busy with biodynamics ever since. He maintains his own container garden, has managed numerous rental gardens, and he helped develop a veggie garden just outside of the town, which supplied bunched salad varieties to a weekly growers market stall. John is also a member and active volunteer with Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Ltd, which is headquartered in Bellingen. His work for the organisation has included making biodynamic preparations, as well as authoring newsletter, educational literature and video resources. A fuller written account of John's biodynamic growing experiences is contained in an associated profile booklet of all the guests interviewed for this podcast series, titled Stories of Our Biodynamic Farmers and Gardeners in Australia. Please see Biodynamics Agriculture Australia Ltd's website for further details of this publication. So John, a very warm welcome to you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thanks, Andrew. It's good to be here. I'm really looking forward to what transpires in our talk.
And let's get into this conversation straight off about your journey through biodynamic growing and your current volunteer work with Biodynamics Agriculture Australia Ltd down there in Bellingen. So the question is, can you give us an overview of your extensive experience of biodynamic growing and various other forms of biodynamic support work over the last quarter of a century or so?
That goes right back to my childhood, actually, because biodynamics didn't appear in my orbit until probably the early 1990s. But prior to that, my farming experience, being a kid of the land, my farming experience opened my eyes to a lot of the issues with conventional agriculture. And I think from an early age, I was aware that it wasn't right, that the advice from the agricultural department of New South Wales to my father wasn't quite right. And just the use of poisons on our farm, arsenic, chloropicrin, it went on and on. And we knew it was dangerous to use these things, and we felt we had to against, the rabbit and the lice on the sheep and so on. And so I was always not only questioning these things, but thinking of better ways of doing it. And because Silent Spring turned up in my life in the 60s, mid-60s, and that was like I could have said, yes, Rachel, you've spoken for me, because I always thought that there was something very wrong with DDT. And so I was ready. And in my experience as a teacher and having been trained as an educator, I'm very aware of that term readiness. And my readiness took quite a long time to come for biodynamics. Prior to that, it came for organics, which was natural for me. And I suppose I was ready by about 1993. And when you're ready, guess what? Things pop up. And for me, the pop-up was going to a horn retrieval up the valley from Bellingen at Thora, and getting amongst like-minded people is a wonderful introduction to something. So these people are already practicing biodynamics, and didn't take long for me to realise it was what I'd been looking for. So from then on, it's just been a matter of applying it to my own place, which was up at Dorrigo, and then later on taking advantage of the openings to come down to Bellingen, which I had to do because of my aged parents needing care. And then instead of doing Meals on Wheels or the RFS or whatever, I decided to come and give my support to what used to be called Biodynamic Farming and Gardening Association, is now called Biodynamic Agriculture Australia. So I came to the source of it all and started volunteering. Went on the payroll for a short time, but since about 2007 or 8, I've been more or less a permanent volunteer here. And the reason I can volunteer is that I generated a military pension through my service as an education officer in the Army, and I can afford to give service without expectation of reward. So I've given my full support physically and intellectually, and I became the editor of the quarterly magazine that members get, the 750 odd members. And I'm still doing it, and I still intend doing it for some time. And what I'd like to finish this response to this particular part with is to recite very briefly Steiner's verse for farmers, and commonly known as the Farmer's Prayer, which tends to encapsulate a lot of what draws me to biodynamics and keeps me in. So here we go. Seek the truly practical material life, but seek it so that it does not numb you to the spirit which is active in it. Seek the spirit, but seek it not in passion for the supersensible, out of supersensible egoism, but seek it because you want to apply it selflessly in practical life in the practical world. Turn to the ancient principle, matter is never without spirit, and spirit is never without matter, in such a way that you say, we will do all material things in the light of the spirit, and we will so seek the light of the spirit that it evokes warmth for us in our practical activities. That was written in 1919.
John, just taking that last comment first from Steiner, what a fantastic marriage of philosophy, psychology, and motivational wisdom there. Considering this bloke was around and about and doing his stuff 100 years ago, and as I've heard from other guests in this series, as we discussed, this was a man ahead of his time in so many different ways, but his insights that have been borrowed into and used in biodynamics. I know we will come back to this. I think it's a very important feature of the discussion we'll have today, that cosmic spiritual side that you've just referred to there. I mean, other things that I just take from that first section is your obvious passion and dedication to biodynamics. Again, that's come across from a number of guests in this series. People seem to be extremely motivated, energized, and passionate about the subject. And finally, that last comment about your very early influence, that insight into the use of pesticides, chemicals on the farm. Again, another comment that's come from a number of guests. They got tired, or they no longer wanted to kill things, I think was the term that I've heard. In terms of conventional approaches to chemical agriculture, chemical growing methods, people just didn't want to do that anymore. So it's interesting to hear your particular sort of very early insight into that, and Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, which we will make put a reference to in the show notes, as along with other sort of reference materials as we go through this. So look, let's that was a bit of going back in time there with Rudolf Steiner's a snippet of his philosophy, but let's come now right back up into 2023 and biodynamics now in the 21st century. From your own perspective, how would you describe biodynamics? You've already started doing that in a very interesting way. But what are some of the basic principles, as far as you see, basic principles and benefits of biodynamic methods as they apply to growing in its various forms?
All right, first of all, I'll go back to that term readiness. I think, generally speaking, it's not a sought commodity, biodynamics, or the practice of it. So people need to be exposed to it in some form or other. In many cases, that'll happen out of spontaneous things, synchronicities for them, or they decide they can attend a workshop and we can talk to people like that. So it's not a big pool of people waiting in line to become practitioners. In fact, it's very rare that people pick this up. And that's still true in 2023, when you'd think there'd be much more of a move towards it, when some of the impacts of conventional agriculture have really started to hit into, aspects of the global environment, and particularly, this warming that's going on. I think if it happened that a large chain like Aldi or Woolworths, a large grocery chain, decided it would only have biodynamic produce, or it would have a strong emphasis on biodynamic produce, it could become a huge problem of, well, there certainly wouldn't be enough cow horns to make 500 because that's become very problematic, getting horns anymore. Biosecurity at abattoirs is incredibly strict these days. And a lot of the tendency in cattle raising is to avoid horns so that you have genetically engineered, if you like, or genetically predisposed poll cattle, or else the horns have been cut off or something. So some of the logistics involved behind biodynamics could make it problematic. And look, personally, I think we could probably go homeopathic biodynamics, but it's a very unpopular area, homeopathics, and I don't think it would, I think it'd come up against a big barrier, but it may well have to be the future, because I think there is something that's very sound in homeopathics. So in terms of being modern, there's this tendency for the cult of the new, that everything has got to be bright and shiny, the tractors and the equipment have got to be all new, and, microchips in everything, and the best of chemicals and the best of research going into everything. That, in other words, the reductionist science approach to conventional agriculture. Whereas ours tends to be same old, let's talk about almost alchemical approach to things. So it's a bit on the nose with people with that modern mindset, let's call it the materialistic mindset. Now, it will soften with necessity, and I think the necessity might be around the corner with extreme climatic events. So I have every hope that, post 2023, that there'll be a real spur to look at alternatives, not just organic alternatives, but the refinements of the biodynamic method. So that's about all I think is necessary to say, that I'm hopeful that biodynamics could increase, not expand so much, but grow, because there's no use if people are forced to do it. Say Aldi says we won't accept vegetables that aren't grown biodynamically. Well, you're going to have a lot of very reluctant growers that say, "Hey, give me the stuff and I'll put it on," or whatever it is. I'll go through the mechanics of it, but there won't be the soul in it, will there? And of course, that's one of the reasons why it probably wouldn't work, because without soul, growing food is always going to result in some sort of deficiency in the food itself. But I'll just leave it at that for the moment, Andrew.
John, that's really intriguing, insight there. Just coming up to that, like around that sort of contrast aspect of biodynamic growing principles as they contrast to more conventional, chemical, industrial, however you want to describe it, methods. And you're talking there about, viewpoints of the supermarket. I get that sense of, how scalable is biodynamics, perhaps up to the largest scale that's run, say, at the industrial level. But on the other hand, the biodynamics as a form of, from my point of view, as a layperson coming into this podcast series and researching it, coming under the umbrella, from my perspective anyway, of a regenerative process of growing, a regenerative form of agriculture that can actually restore damaged soil, that is far less impacting on the climate, because it can actually sequester carbon into the soil. It conserves biodiversity through the plants and animal plant cover that it puts on the soil, therefore the animals that are supported by it, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that is the, whatever the actual full-scale commercial imperative, I know that always wins out, but do you think that is the argument that it seemed to be that you were implying there, that environmentally protective argument is strongly in favour of biodynamics versus, more conventional ways of growing?
Well, I may come at your question a little bit obliquely, because I think, first of all, we need to understand what is the difference between the scientific materialistic approach and the holistic approach, which is the underpinning of biodynamics. And this is borrowed from somewhere else. It's not my original thing, but I've really adopted this as if it is mine. But if we look at the scientific, it's a Newtonian is usually the term used for it. It's the rational or reductionist approach to things, whether it's industry or whether it's agriculture. And the reductionist approach is underpinned by fear and doubt and skepticism and even distrust. And it tends to work in the death realm rather than the life force realm. And generally, the expert is outside of it. It's the scientist or the economist, right? Now, I'm sure we can all recognise that generally our society, our modern scientific society, works on that basis. Now, almost the opposite to that is the holistic or Goethean, which is Steiner's background, Goethe, and it's characterised by courage and confidence and enthusiasm, and tends to work in the life force realm and natural processes, right? Not putting on soluble chemicals, but allowing nature to have its own particular form of growth impetus. And the expert is inside us, not outside us. Now, that's obviously going to require training and so on. But that sort of puts it in a nutshell, that they're quite not opposed, but they're quite different realms that we're working in, the Newtonian and the holistic. And so we come down to, how do you get it out there? How do you scale it up so it's significant? At the moment, I'd have to say in Australia that practice of biodynamics is pretty small. There are two lots of us. There's the Podolinsky group, and there's this one up here at Bellingen. And we have a fair bit of clout, but it's not huge in relation to conventional or even organic agriculture. And what I'd like to say, at one stage I thought, instead of putting out Agent Orange over Vietnam, we should have been using the C-130s to put out the preps up and down the better watered parts of Australia, irrespective of what people think is under the flight path. However, there is a possibility of that. And I'll give you an anecdote of a friend of mine who bought a property near Kilkeven, a 350-acre property. And the contract, the signatures on the contract, the ink was virtually still wet. And he was on his quad with stirred soil activator, which is one of our best and most powerful preparations. It contains all the preparations, including the horn manure. And he was out on this quad late in the afternoon, having stirred the thing for the requisite amount of time. He went around his boundary, around all the internal subdivisions, to get the prep out as soon as he could. And he didn't go up and down each paddock and cover every square metre either. He just did these circuits. And we know that energy moves to complete the voids when you do this sort of work. And that's how his approach was: get it out straight away, any time of the year. It's an imperative to get this influence, this energetic influence of biodynamics onto the property. Now that's the key to how you can get it out to people. Look, just do it. Don't think about it too much. We'll assure you that it will have an effect. And so it could be scaled up, I'm sure, if people's imagination allowed it to happen and their intent was strong enough. So I've got every hope that it could be done. It's just a matter of, mobilising opinion and practicalities.
We're talking about biodynamics specifically, but in that, that wider spectrum of more regenerative forms of growing, permaculture, organic growing as well. I'm just reminded of the book I finished not so long ago, Charlie Massey's Call of the Reed Warbler, which is a fantastic set of, amongst other things, case studies of various forms of regenerative agriculture, including biodynamics, but actual case studies of people on the ground that have been, instituting these models of growing these more environmentally protective and also just better ways of growing nutritious food in Australia for years and years. I mean, I think one of the claims in that book is that potentially regenerative agriculture, including biodynamics, could regenerate potentially millions of hectares of land ultimately, if, again, as you say, if the actual impetus was there. It's like that classic thing that we see in the environment across the board, really. We have not the technology in this case, but we have the methods, we have the processes, and we do have the technology to turn stuff around massively. It's not often the actual abilities, it's the will. It might be the political will, it might be the cultural will, I don't know, but it's more to do with that aspect of people's ability to take on new ideas and run with them. And again, I've heard that from other guests in this series, that they've all been in effect pioneers to some extent in the field of getting this message on biodynamics out there, but they have encountered resistance at times, and they have encountered that sort of doubting view that, oh, well, what's this? Surely this can't be right. So, and you gave us a little vignette story about that, in effect, in terms of your own consciousness, of changed consciousness when you were very young, growing up on your parents' farm, looking at the chemical inputs that went on there. So I think this is and just reacting against that, just feeling that couldn't be right. So this seems to be a good point to go back in time again. You started telling us about this, but give us more detail about how you became involved with biodynamic growing in the first place. You have explained that, but give us some more detail around that. Any light bulb moments for you? You mentioned that Carson book, but influential mentors, influencers, and also the key resources you've tapped into over the years to help build your knowledge and expertise. I mean, you are a trainer in the topic yourself. You are hugely knowledgeable, but anything you might have to say about how you acquired that very, very extensive knowledge and skill base?
Andrew, I'm essentially a quintessential eclectic. And I left school and went into a law firm, became an article clerk, decided that wasn't for me after 18 months, etc. Then I went and trained as a wool classer. I did a beekeeping course. This is way back in the in the 60s, and gardened like mad. I got into the Henry Doubleday Research Association and got Russian comfrey going in a quarter-acre backyard in Sydney with my first home. Had bees there as well, and geese and chooks and every other damn thing. As you do when you're intensive in trying to grow food for yourself and be self-sufficient. And I had a young family. And then it wasn't long before I discovered dowsing and things of the spirit. And hence I'm very open to any philosophy that deals with the spirit, especially anthroposophy. But I've done various courses of training one of them was actually Vipassana meditation at Blackheath, the silent meditation, you know, with Goenka, the sort of head of the whole thing, on every morning on a video at 4:30 or something. No, we were meditating till 6. So at 6 o'clock we'd watch this video, and his great big call to us all was just observe. And you know, things like that go in very deep. And I've been on psychic weekends when I was attending University of New South Wales. Went up to Orange and did psychic weekends where we did past lives, you know, rebirthing and stuff. That was very interesting. It gives you insights into the spirit. And I've always dowsed, although not for water so much, although I've dabbled in that. I've avoided trying to be so much under pressure as you are when you're dowsing for water. People want result and they want to be able to make money out of, you know, the bore and all the water they're going to get. So I avoid that. But I certainly practice dowsing. I'm a practicing dowser. And I have a lot of faith in the results of dowsing, as long as you're not looking for personal gain, because the whole thing in my life is about service. Service is my big thing. And so all those things have been not just for me, but for me to be a better person in this world. So when it comes to the influences towards biodynamics, I also did a permaculture design course, and I had Robin Francis, who was just absolutely amazing. And I met Bill Mollison and had good chats with Bill. So I have a great feeling for what permaculture can do. But mind you, it's hard to imagine permaculture being scaled up to supply, you know, Sydney with food. But it's a wonderful process, and it stands on its own feet to some extent, except I think it can be improved with biodynamics in some forms. Even land care can be improved with biodynamics, like root dips for plants before they're put into riparian zones and things. It can give them a big start. There are elements of biodynamics that can fit in with these things. The syntropic agroforestry, which is the latest thing on the block, hey, it can really prosper. It can actually get a big boost from biodynamics, and it's being done by friends of mine actually at the moment, where it's integrated with biodynamic practices. So we can be an assistance to other forms of growing. We'll just call it growing. It doesn't have to dominate all the time. It can be a useful thing. And in the case of call of the reed warbler, this kind of large-scale plantings by graziers, and even on the Monaro, yes, it can help to establish things and give whatever is planted, whether it be a forest or a savanna or whatever it is, it can give it resilience. It can allow the plants to establish quickly and give them a certain resilience, because one of the things that happens with biodynamics pretty much universally, as soon as you apply it, because of its stimulation of the soil food web, the production of humus, shouldn't call it really production, but the formation of humus is accelerated, which is actually carbonation of the soil. This is the putting down of carbon into soil. And in the poorest of country, like around Tingha, in sandy country that was mined for tin, I've seen with my own eyes how up to 4 inches of darkened soil can occur in 1 or 2 years. That's provided it's not in the middle of a drought. The weeds can become palatable to stock. These are the sort of miracle things that you can see in very needy or poor environments or degraded soil. And so there's a big call for something across large areas to speed up the process of regeneration. And I think in Charles Massey's case, he got onto it. He looked around a fair bit. His book is very enlightening in that way, that he not only was a highly trained scientist, but he was prepared to look at other examples and imitate them, if not better them. So I see a big role for biodynamics to play in that, and that's what I've viewed during my life, even despite the fact I was in army classrooms mostly, I could see this happening. And being a geography teacher, as is my training, and being able to go out on field trips, even before I got involved in my own place, I was actively encouraging and building the knowledge in other people of these possibilities. So biodynamics was very natural for me. As I say, I was more than ready for it by the mid-90s.
And thanks for that, John. As with other guests, always fascinating, intriguing to hear, how they got from A to Z, or still pursuing Z on the journey of professional discovery and innovation. And just one or 2 points. Again, I'm just picking this up as sort of random. You said you're an eclectic person, a borrowing person. You borrow in, experiences, learnings, etc. To and then sort of collate that into a bigger picture whole. So that theme of holism, which again has been coming out of our discussion here, everything is connected to everything else, and so for that idea of very close observation of the world. You talked about your meditation practice there. It's, for me, again, on that holistic basis, almost links to this idea in biodynamic growing. Again, I've heard this from guests, the very close observation they pay to their properties, to their land, the ability that they using that observation to fine tune what they do on the land. It's not just a question of slapping stuff on, walking off and then forgetting about it. It's almost like a day by day close observation, seeing the changes, sometimes very subtle changes they've achieved, and then using that to fine tune and calibrate what they do next. So again, I think it's a nice illustration of how all of these things link together. So John, moving through this lovely and fascinating interview, let's hear a bit more about your biodynamic work over the years. You've already given us, some good examples of that. But I know, as you mentioned, your past, military educational career, and I know that you've been very active in recent years, more than that, in educating new and existing biodynamic growers on the benefits of biodynamic adoption. So what have been some of the beneficial impacts of that work that you've been doing in your view?
Well, I've been very supportive of the processes and production here at the office, where we make the preparations and distribute them. So I've always been part of the team outside making the stuff, packing and dispatching, and also inside helping to word things and supporting in an administrative sense, until finally I became an editor of the magazine. I've stepped back to associate editor, but I still have a lot of input. But the big thing for me was getting out to the members out in the far-flung states and seeing how they're doing things, picking up all sorts of interesting things, and coming back to write them up, so that I was in that unique position where I could go out and do the presentations and come back and write them up to distribute those ideas and so on to the members through the magazine, which is quarterly, which is quite a frequent sort of magazine. Most of the similar magazines have gone out to 6 monthly, but we've kept it at quarterly, which is a lot of work to put together, but it's also highly informative. And some people keep them as sets of reference. That's how they go down. They're treated with great significance, and I treat them very seriously. Yeah, the stuff I put in there, the collection of articles and so on, the things I write myself, I take it very seriously. But getting out to the regions is so important. It's a pity that COVID intervened and we couldn't do it anymore for a time. And since that time, things have changed so much that we have difficulty getting quorum together. We've advertised lots and lots of time, well, a number of times, not lots, but lots of people can't either afford it, or in monetary terms, or can't afford the time, and we don't get enough nominations to run the courses. So anyhow, we'll deal with that as time goes on. But getting out to people is so amazing. For a start, the hosts have to be pretty special people to allow people to come onto their properties for a start, to be happy with that. And the people who turn up from the local areas, and some come a long way to come to these workshops, they are such interesting people. The most educational thing for an instructor, actually, to go on these workshops, and you hear a lot of variations in practice. And I don't sort of stand in judgment over people's approach to biodynamics. Some people are highly detailed in what they do, so much so it's almost painful to hear the difficulties that they encounter, because you can actually simplify biodynamics tremendously, but you can also make it incredibly complex. We have a handbook here, which I've been part of editing, and we've still got another round of editing shortly, but a handbook that goes out with every member, to every member who becomes a member, to the new members. And the handbook is very thorough, tells you exactly what to do with diagrams and so on. There's no doubt as to what to do to become a biodynamic practitioner, but a lot of people take their own attitude to it and invent new techniques and so on. Here's a good example. How do you get the preparations out onto very inaccessible country, say on a cattle property? Well, we now have the Shane Joyce tea bag, which is a handmade shade cloth bag, about a foot by a foot by a foot, and it's half filled with soil activator, and it goes in the troughs, in the water troughs. Well, the soil activator infuses into the water, the cattle get it into their bodies, take it out and urinate it and poo it all over the place, and over a period of time, that is very good coverage of the country. It could be rocky, ridgy country, and there's your biodynamic applications. And plus the animals gain quite a health boost from ingesting this stuff. So these are, I mean, examples abound of this kind of thing. So when we go out and do walks across these properties, or whether they're gardens or horticulture, whatever they are, the amount of learning that goes on for the participants is just amazing. And my own, of course, and my co-presenters is also very, very significant. And this is the thing about biodynamics, it needs to be kept alive. And I think just staying on your property and trying to be self-sufficient, and one of the principles of biodynamics is the sort of sovereignty of the property, and lowering as much as possible the inputs coming from outside, because a property can generate its own fertiliser, so to speak, its own fertility enhancers, shall we call them, in all sorts of forms, compost and liquid manures and so on. It can become rather sort of reclusive and suspicious of the outsiders, because a lot of the neighbours look very askance at biodynamics. They think it's, I don't know, there's just this critical look at it, that it doesn't involve the same expenditure. I mean, a fertiliser bill on one guy's property went from 60,000 when he was conventionally converted to biodynamics, and in a very short time it was down to, very small amount, less than $10,000. And even that's, it's hard to spend that, because your property is capable of generating an enormous amount of fertility with these preparations, with the enhancements. So I've just had my eyes open to the possibilities. There's nowhere that can't benefit from this, whether it be mine site regeneration, whether it be enhancing already quite good systems of horticulture, and see the trees sort of regenerate themselves. I've been to, say, macadamia orchards and seen the dieback that occurs when you're not putting on all the proper things, and the difference that biodynamic preparations can make to the health of those trees is enormous in a very short time. And we have the ability to enhance existing fertilizers, say, for instance, a seaweed fertilizer or fish fertilizer. We get those in here, we buy them in bulk, and we put the preparations in them before we redistribute them. And the preparations actually are the compost preparations, which enhance the value, the fertilizing value of those fish and seaweed emulsions. I mean, simple stuff, but we can do it in such a way that we're a service to our members. They could go and buy those and do them themselves, but we can do it here centrally for people who haven't got the time or the facilities to do it themselves.
So, John, we've been talking there about biodynamics as this excellent form of efficient regenerative growing, and the excellent, produce that comes out of that growing. The way that you've been spreading the word, both yourself and Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Ltd, over the years, the the benefits of getting that message out to as many people as possible. But I also understand, and again, you started to refer to this, and I've heard this from other guests in the series, that in addition to those external benefits, often the grower themselves, the person on the land using these methods also benefits. And so for you particularly, to add to that substantial list of biodynamic benefits, what have been the beneficial impacts on you personally of being involved with this form of growing?
That's a good one. I think if you study Steiner, you can pick up some very good things that you might have already had within you, but they can be strengthened. Positivity, for instance, and openness, and non-judgmentalism. I mean, these are very easy things to fall into. Judgmentalism is rife. It's within us all. Even things like the world being more or less at war at the moment. I know in my heart that we all have war in us, right? War isn't out there. War's within ourselves. And if we adopt an adversarial approach to anything at all, whether it's like, I've got a problem out there and it's an insect and I've got to kill it, and this goes back to the cockatoos at Sam Statham's place. Now, we had 70 odd people there, and I have a great reluctance to make a display of dowsing, because with dowsing you need to be able to drop yourself into your alpha state, right? That's your meditative state with eyes closed. There are shortcuts with drugs, of course, to get into this. That's why drugs are so popular. Once you're in that state and you're aware of what you can do with it, you can actually invoke and speak with group souls. All animal species and insect species have group souls. And the cockatoo group soul is very receptive. And all I could do was say, look, I normally do this quietly, subvocally, but I'm just going to demonstrate to you people, those 72 people, what can be done. And the cockatoos have been nipping off all the new growth on the vines, on the grapevines. They'd been eating the olives. They're making a real mess of things, and they were installed. They were there on that property, and so I wanted to do a communication with them such that they would leave the property, but it wasn't expelling them. It wasn't telling them, go to blazes, out you go. So we did a little deal with them, as was done at Findhorn with the elemental beings. You need to have a chat and come up with a reasonable idea. So Sam said, well, let's give them the outer row of olives and ask them to leave the bulk of the property, which is what I did in front of people with eyes with eyes closed, but vocally with a rod in front of me, because the divining rod shows you where they're in. It comes around to the left to show you that you're in communication, and when the message has been received, the rod moves back to directly ahead. If it's in the negative case, it goes around to the right. So I did all this in front of everybody, and because we were staying there, the two presenters were staying there on the farm, we were able to see what happened that night. And Sam was quite amazed, because there was a tremendous raucous going on with these cockatoos at about dusk, and they all decamped. They left the property that night. So it definitely worked. And things like that and everybody else was informed that that's what happened. So it's sort of convincing, isn't it? when you can do things like that. So I've done a lot of work with animals and insects, and proved that it's easy enough to talk to these group souls. And as long as you're reasonable about things, you can come up with all sorts of solutions. So we don't have to be out there killing things. We can do diversionary work, and sometimes the peppering thing, it's an aspect of biodynamics. It's very interesting. We can actually get things to move away with burning the carcass or the skins of large animals, or even in the case of insects doing the same. And we can expel the animals and the insects from our area. But there are other ways in which we can do things without killing as such. You know? And I think these little extras added onto biodynamics using cosmic influences, which is a very important part of biodynamics. We need to be astrologers as well as astronomers to be right in there. Now, I'm not saying, and this is an important point I'm going to make now, I don't think people who join the practice of biodynamics need to become chemists or biochemists. I don't think they need to become soil scientists. I don't need to be extreme about any of these things. We don't need to understand insect and animal behavior. In other words, we don't need to become zoologists. We don't need to become astronomers and astrologers. We don't need to become anthroposophists, although it's very handy if we have the time and inclination to go into that. We need to take control of ourselves, our willing, our feeling, our intents. That's important. We don't need to become detailed specialists in all these fields. And my approach is dabbling and somewhat eclectic, which allows me to have all these little other doors to enter the domain, the realm. I find that if you show people some of these things, they need to see it once. Just once is enough, and they'll go away and do it themselves. That's why I like to be on display to some extent, and certainly not an ego trip. But I like to think that I'm opening people's minds, giving them some little thing that they can grasp and practice themselves. And that's a very effective way of getting it out there. But best if they see it in your words rather than some scientific journal.
Thanks again, John. Again, I mean, it's a very rich section there, trying to actually not summarize it, but just take a few points out. Again, from a layperson listening to this, sort of reinterpret that. But that last point you just made, I mean, I've heard this theme. One way of expressing this might be a black box theme, that biodynamics, as with other sort of ideas, but biodynamic growing is an accessible form of doing things. It's a pragmatic, practical way of doing things, but it is underpinned by deep philosophical, spiritual, cosmic elements. But the thing is, the black box comes in is you don't need to know in depth about those things to actually get the workings of the biodynamic method working for you. That's the black box. You see it, you're looking at this box, it might be moving, there's a mechanism in there, you're not exactly sure what the mechanism is. But you don't need to know that. One of the other guests said, look, you don't need to know how a mobile phone works to get the benefit out of it. You don't need to know how a computer works in depth to get the benefit out of it, obviously. So that sort of approach. But nonetheless, those deeper elements, which you did give us a flavor of as well, one of those, that fantastic anecdote about Sam Statham on Rosnay Farm, down there near Canundra in New South Wales. I mean, Sam is actually in this series as well, so listeners can go and listen to his account, his stories as well. But you're visiting him on the property, and that dowsing story, which for me, I almost like linking to an idea of expanded consciousness. The idea that we do have, how you might put this, almost. If we listen hard enough, we understand that we do have what some people would consider to be solely an indigenous worldview, that we're not separate from nature, we're an integral part of nature, and therefore our energies can interact with the energies, and they do interact with the energies of other species. We can collaborate with other species if we tune in sufficiently well to ourselves. And it seems to me that muscle testing, dowsing sort of methodology is one aspect of how you can tune in to a deeper level of consciousness to get that connection that is in us all. But most people have tuned out to it. And most people in the West, let's say, for want of a better term, or in neoliberal economic society, have just not tuned into their own consciousness within themselves. And so they miss that. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but that was me trying to make sense of that, deeper aspect. But the point is, biodynamics is a practical, at another level, it's a practical set of methods and approaches to growing that works whether you understand that depth stuff or not. Would that be a fair way of putting it, John? Or
you've been saying good things there, and it stimulates me to go to the probably a crucial point here, and that is, I think we all have a duty to each other, to ourselves, and to the society to progress ourselves, right? And we've got to be careful with biodynamics because it can bog down. If I handed somebody the agricultural lectures and said, here, take that away, you can become a biodynamicist, most people, I think 9 out of 10 would give up very quickly. We had a study group here studying the 8 lectures a few years ago. We spent a year doing it. We went through all the lectures and we're ready to do them all again the next year, because it is very subtle. Steiner's work, his indications, is very subtle, and to get the full meaning of it takes a lot of reflection after you actually read it. So I have a thing about this. When I go out and instruct to people, I say, look, if you really want to get started, just go and do it. Here's the handbook. Here's a handbook, right? Very straightforward, simple. Now, at the same time, you must think about reading something that's very accessible, that will convince you about the truth of this, and it'll open up for you a door, a portal into this world of subtle energies. Now, I dwell in subtle energy all the time. You know, I'm in a group of people, they're always talking about esoterics and subtlety, and oh, we're just on the Mencius today, would you believe? And, you know, Tao Te Ching, the whole lot. But look, for somebody starting, I say, unless you're absolutely skint and you haven't got a penny to bless yourself with, go and buy yourself a couple of books. Now, the first book to buy is Secrets of the Soil. It has, within its covers, is the most exquisite and simple version of energetics as applied to life and agriculture. It's a wonderful book written quite a few years ago, still in print, by 2 journalistic sort of guys, Tompkins and Bird. Their first book, which is a bestseller as well, was Secret Life of Plants. It talked about lie detectors and all sorts of things, and very interesting too. But Secrets of the Soil definitely got to be read. I'd say it's a necessary reading if you're going to be a biodynamicist. It'll really inspire you, really get you going. Practical, theoretical, esoteric. If you really want to get down into the world of the spirit and the world of elemental beings, you must read The Findhorn Garden. That was an outstanding experiment that the world of the spirit allowed these 4 people to come into and to see it and to publicise it and to set up a foundation which still exists today. And The Findhorn Garden is a book, still in print, and it's a wonderful little excursion into opening minds. Now, those 2 books alone, there'd be very few people who wouldn't be deeply affected by them and deeply introduced into biodynamics. Not just biodynamics, a different sort of life. Really about a term seems to restrict, it'll open things up. And there's a whole hierarchy of other books which people can indulge in after that if they so wish. And I could go on with lots and lots of, including some of Steiner's book, like Occult Science and so on. But they tend to get deeper and deeper, and they're not for everybody. All right? But I do think it's necessary for people to do a bit of reading. And of course, all this stuff is so much on the web. You'd be amazed at anything you want to know about biodynamics, it's there in volumes. Any term you like to throw into it, there's volumes appear in front of you. So there's no shortage of information, no shortage of stimulation and stimulants of the intellectual kind to get yourself into biodynamics. Look, it's so big. Biodynamics is so big, it appears to be small because so few people are involved in it. But, you know, it begins with the flavour of a biodynamic fruit or the appearance of the archetype of the plant. I talked about giantism at Dorrigo. Well, it wasn't just giantism as a result of all my work there and the assistance of nature there. It was actually the plants being allowed to, being freed up to show their full archetype, their full potential. And of course, a lot of vegetable plants can be very big. You know, Findhorn had, 15-pound cabbages and things. You know, it's not as if they were freaks. It was as if that's what the plant's genetic code is able to do. And you can free all that up. And it's quite amazing when you get involved in it. And I still do it today. You know, exceptional vegetables is ho-hum, nothing much at all. But but feeling better in yourself, of course, feeling more confident, and being able to exercise your willpower with great ease, being particularly in terms of intent, knowing that your intent, if you feel it strong enough and practice it, you are becoming, with that, a co-creator. You're creating stuff all the time. Now, a lot of us are doing it without realizing it, but it's no secret. But we can become creators all the time, and the indication that we're successful in that is lots of synchronicities. Once the synchronicities start being noticed more and more, you know you're in the zone. Anyhow, and I'd like to say one thing about this messaging that we put out through our intent is, I think of all the other little books that you could get, the ones on the frozen crystals crystals of water that Emoto did, Masuro Emoto, years ago, became bestsellers. He's on television and everything. Tends to have somehow disappeared out of the media, but that we can put our thoughts into water. We can put fertility into water. We don't even need to add anything to it except our thoughts. Some of my water containers have love and gratitude written on bits of paper attached to them, because I know that goes into the water. You know, these things are already out there. It's funny that not everybody, A, knows about it, or B, practices it.
I think that goes for a lot of areas of human endeavor, isn't it? Cutting edge, innovative, good, interesting new stuff. But unfortunately, it doesn't always get into the zeitgeist. But look, we've been spending a fair amount of time talking about that bigger picture, spiritual, cosmic aspect of biodynamics. You've given us some great resources there. We'll put them in the show notes. I mean, some of those book titles have been cited by other guests. So, I mean, clearly there are some go-to books and resources that people have mentioned, and I'll put those onto the show notes, the ones that are straightforward to find anyway, to cut down the amount of time people have to spend searching for them. But look, as we now move through this great interview, John, talking about, just coming off of that, spiritual cosmic side of biodynamics, almost touching on the history of the evolution of ideas and practices, how they get adapted over time. I mean, for a sort of set of philosophies, processes, practices that have been around for 100 years or so, it's hardly surprising that some of those ideas from Steiner have been adapted, are being adapted, are constantly evolving. And adaptation is, one part of that process of managing things, of doing things well, being ahead of the game in terms of adaptation, in terms of responding to challenges, for instance. So I just wanted to ask you, because you've been giving us this brilliant sort of overview of all the positive benefits that have been coming out of your work within biodynamics over the years, but nonetheless, you must have encountered, I'm assuming, some challenges, some stresses, some pushbacks, perhaps, or some other issues that have come across as a challenge. So, what have they been for you, and how have you worked to overcome them?
Well, yeah, good one. Age. I've had to ease back on my physical output. I used to have a very nice garden, demonstration garden around the office here. It was full of all nice things, and I've had to sort of, because I've had other gardens as well, I've had to sort of pull back a bit there. And I would like to have done more innovatory things. I mean, I'm just setting up a test on bions at the moment, which is an article in the latest newsleaf, which we dealt with. So I'm still active outside there, but I'd like to get some better structures in our infrastructure here. The quality of our preparations, well, I'm pretty sure they're okay. Very good. I'd like to be out more with people, and that's sad, really, that we're not doing more workshops, because there are a lot of people out there who want them, but we can't get out there. It's very expensive to get out there, and it's very difficult to do it, to actually screw yourself up to the point where you can do it, and you've made time, and there's always difficult things in your personal life to get out all the time, like the traveling salesman. It can be a very lonely sort of job between water holes, but I feel I do my best, but there are limitations, and as I get older, there's the energy thing. But no, I still full of it all, and I'm very keen to continue doing it for the time being. And I'd say with biodynamics, there aren't any limits. There are no limits to this because it's not just about some little thing called biodynamics. It's about a totally new approach to the planet. You know, I mean, it's a pity it's not in the water, that everybody drank this water and came out of it transformed in some way into an awareness of what we really are, because we aren't really just a body. Oh, come on, we're a spirit form, and we go through, you know, incarnations and so on. I mean, anybody who denies that, well, sorry about that. So there's a long way to go before the world can sort itself out and get off the fossil fuels and, you know, start being friendly towards it, kind towards each other. That would be nice. And I think our particular discipline, our biodynamics and spirituality, is certainly along the way. You know, just how we can scale it up is another issue altogether. But yeah, I could go on sort of more or less relevant to that, but that's the core of it. It's our heritage. It's about time we all woke up to it.
So many themes there. Just on that one thing about getting the message out there, I mean, again, I think it's something I've heard across the board. I mean, I work for a small environment protection organisation up here and in touch with other ones in this area. And there's something about that perhaps drop off of voluntarism, generally the aging demographic of many, many groups, they don't seem to be getting sort of so much fresh blood in at the other end. I mean, again, whether that's in terms of long-term trends in society, there's various theories about that. Also, that servant leadership model that you supply, you know, you said a couple of points, I think, in the interview, you know, you're there to serve, but you're also there to lead. And again, I think that ethos of a humble leader, but who actually gives of themselves, but actually does offer good leadership. I mean, that seems to be in short supply as well. We need more of those. We definitely need more of those. And perhaps in terms of getting the message out, this digital medium that we're using here now, I mean, it's not the entire substitution for good face-to-face contact, but in a very busy world where, for whatever reason, voluntarism is dropping off, whether we like it or not, perhaps this is one substitute. And, you know, we try and get the message out there through online videos, podcasts, etc., but always, I suppose, looking to that gold standard of direct face-to-face instruction, training, and example setting. But you're talking there, John, right at the end about the absolute value of biodynamics and other forms of regenerative agriculture and other forms of environmentally protective human endeavor in general, bracketing all that together. What does the future hold for the planet? What does it hold for society? What does it hold for us? So coming right back down to you as the person being interviewed in this wonderful interview, the question is, what does the future hold for you in your biodynamic work?
Okay, before I depart this mortal coil, I would very much appreciate if everybody treated the earth as sacred. And by the earth, I mean everything on the earth, including especially the soil, which is where biodynamics seems to focus quite a lot of its practicality. So the earth is a sacred being, and life is a gift from heaven. And the astronomers are getting there because they've now got dark energy, which I think is possibly id, chi, orgone, whichever you like to say, the etheric force, the life-giving force. It's there, and even science is going to suddenly wake up one day and say, hey, you guys have been right all along. All your spiritualists have been right. And I mean, even AI may pick this up someday. I somehow doubt it. But there's such a thing as spirit, and you can't build that into a machine. That's my sort of final word. We need to be treating Earth as sacred. That's a very special attribute of where we are and who we are.
You mentioned Goethe, however you pronounce it, the German philosopher, scientist, a 19th century guy who, in fact, was one of the influences on Steiner. I mean, even back then, going back as late as the late 18th century, early 19th century, a realization that this new industrial scientific reductionist society that was being generated through the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, had its major downsides, and the whole Romantic movement as a sort of counter to that, to say, hey, you know, let's not lose sight of the sacred. which we largely have in the West. I think that's indisputable. And along with losing that sense of the sacred, losing a sense of respect for nature. I've just finished reading, again, another book, lovely book, not specifically about biodynamics, but it's worth a read. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. Yeah, Robin Val Kimmerer. Yeah, because it's a lovely synthesis. I mean, she is an American scientist, a botanist, but she's also a First Nations American heritage person. And so she's been blending this sort of earlier First Nations indigenous view about plants, which she was always fascinated in, but then she trained in Western science, in Western botany, but bringing those two things together. And I think it's doable. But, she points out that the English language itself just doesn't have the capacity to describe other than human beings in anything other than a sort of objective way. It's that Thomas Berry thing as well, a world full of objects versus a world full of subjects. We're in relation to other than human beings. If only we could actually just tune in and realize that. Fantastic. Look, I'll put some links to those books as well, because I think, as part of that general wider spiritual philosophy that you have referred to several times, John, I think that more, 21st century take on that sort of viewpoint might be interesting to listeners. But look, as we now come up to the end of this fantastic interview, chunking down to the last couple of questions. First one, do you have a short take-home message? You covered a lot of ground today, but perhaps a few sentences or so which could help distill your ideas, reinforce what you've been talking about today for listeners.
Okay, if there's anybody listening to this who isn't already engaged in higher level spiritual matters or even in the practice of biodynamics, I say, you don't know what you're missing, get into it. Follow my advice about reading Tompkins and Bird, Secrets of the Soil, and you can't go wrong. And if it's not for you, it's not for you. If you're not ready, you're not ready. So no screwing of arms here. We don't advocate this is the only thing to do. There are many roads leading to Rome, but in the end, it'll be seeking our true consciousness and finding the sacredness of things.
John, raising consciousness, being more aware of the fragility of the earth around us, paying more attention to that, being more intentional. Lovely way to end this wonderful interview. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today. I know for a fact you've given our audience a whole lot of thought-provoking ideas which can help their next steps toward getting into biodynamics or applying biodynamic growing methods, taken from some of the intriguing and environmentally protective approaches to growing you've described today. As with other guests in this series, your story has given us some examples of the important abilities of biodynamics to regenerate soil, supercharge organic growing, restore biodiversity, and work with Mother Nature. And so, John, it's time to say goodbye. On behalf of both the podcast production and support organisations which made this podcast possible, they are Householders Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Incorporated Australia, and, of course, Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Ltd. I want to thank you so very much for our conversation today.
It's been a pleasure being here talking with you. We could talk on for hours about these things in a very meaningful way, Andrew. And thank you so much for your input, because you've done a marvellous job putting this thing together for both the other guests and myself. And I have deep gratitude for what you're doing. Thank you.
You've been listening to an episode in the podcast series Biodynamic Farmers and Gardeners in Australia. The series was produced by Householders Options to Protect the Environment, Hope Incorporated Australia, with the generous funding support of Biodynamic Agriculture Australia Ltd. It has been a pleasure to help raise awareness of some of the environmentally protective values of biodynamic growing practice in its ability to regenerate the biological health of soil, supercharge organic growing, restore biodiversity, and work in harmony with Mother Nature. Please consult the episode show notes for possible follow-up material on topics discussed in interview and any relevant contact details should you wish to respond to anything you have heard. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider promoting it across your networks and giving it a positive rating in your preferred podcast app. You can also give us feedback via the short 5-minute online survey using the link also available in the show notes. My name is Andrew Nicholson, producer of the series, and thank you for listening.